The morning sun cast long shadows across the training facility at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado as Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Rivera adjusted his dive gear one final time. At 28 years old, Rivera had spent the last 6 years mastering the dangerous art of Navy diving operations. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision as he checked the seals on his dry suit, a routine that had saved his life more times than he could count. Rivera stood 5 feet 10 inches tall with the lean, muscular build typical of Navy divers. His dark hair was cropped short according to military regulations, and his brown eyes held the steady confidence that came from surviving countless underwater missions in hostile environments. 3 deployment tours in the Persian Gulf had taught him that the ocean was both ally and enemy, depending entirely on how well you understood her rules. The training exercise schedule for that December morning was supposed to be routine. Rivera and his dive team were conducting cold water survival drills in the Coronado Channel, preparing for potential Arctic operations. The water temperature hovered around 42 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill an unprepared swimmer in minutes, but manageable for trained Navy divers with proper equipment. Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez briefed the team on the morning's objectives. At 35, Martinez had more underwater time logged than most submarine crews. Her reputation for thorough preparation and zero tolerance for shortcuts had earned her the respect of every diver under her command. She stood before the assembled team of 8 divers, her voice carrying the authority that came from 15 years of military service. "Today we're running emergency surface protocols," Martinez announced, consulting her waterproof clipboard. "Each team will simulate equipment failure scenarios at depths between 60 and 90 feet. Surface intervals will be timed and monitored. Weather conditions are optimal with minimal surface chop and visibility extending to 40 feet underwater." Rivera partnered with Petty Officer First Class David Shun, a 26-year-old computer specialist who had cross-trained as a combat diver. Chin's technical background made him invaluable for missions involving underwater demolition and salvage operations. Despite being newer to diving than Rivera, Chun had proven himself reliable under pressure during their previous deployments together. The dive boat Seahawk motored out into the channel as the team conducted final equipment checks. Rivera tested his breathing apparatus, confirmed his depth gauge readings, and verified that his emergency ascent systems functioned properly. The familiar weight of the gear felt reassuring against his shoulders as he mentally reviewed the day's procedures. "Water temperature is holding steady at 42 degrees, reported Hospital Corpsman Second Class Jennifer Walsh, the team's medical specialist. Walsh monitored physiological data for all divers during cold water operations, watching for early signs of hypothermia or nitrogen narcosis. Her medical training had prevented several potential diving accidents over the years. As the Seahawk reached the designated dive zone, Rivera noticed another vessel anchored roughly 200 yards away. The 40-foot recreational fishing boat Northern Pride displayed Washington state registration numbers, indicating it had traveled south of the warmer California waters. Several figures moved about the deck, and Rivera could see fishing lines trailing from the stern. Captain Tom Bradley commanded the Northern Pride with the swagger of someone who had spent more time reading boating magazines than actually navigating open water. At 53 years old, Bradley had purchased the vessel 6 months earlier using proceeds from selling his small construction business in Seattle. His lack of maritime experience was compensated for, in his mind, by expensive navigation equipment and a willingness to ignore safety regulations when they interfered with his fishing plans. Bradley's crew consisted of 3 friends from his old neighborhood: Mike Kowalski, a 40-year-old machinist, Jerry Thompson, a 38-year-old sales representative, and Dave Mueller, a 45-year-old electrician. None of the 4 men possessed significant boating experience, but they made up for their ignorance with enthusiasm and a cooler full of beer that they had been sampling since dawn. "Navy boys are setting up some kind of training exercise," Kowalski observed, pointing toward the military dive boat with his beer can. "Probably practicing how to swim in circles or some other government waste of taxpayer money." Bradley squinted through his binoculars at the Navy vessel, noting the disciplined movements of the dive team as they prepared their equipment. "Bunch of show-offs," he muttered. "Real men don't need all that fancy gear to work underwater. Back in my day, we just held our breath and got the job done." Thompson laughed and took another swig of beer. "Maybe we should show them how it's done, Tom. Bet you could stay underwater longer than any of those military pretty boys." The suggestion appealed to Bradley's inflated ego. He had been regaling his friends with increasingly exaggerated stories about his non-existent military service throughout the morning. The presence of actual Navy personnel represented a challenge to his carefully constructed persona as a tough, experienced veteran. Those divers think they're so special with their government training and expensive equipment, Bradley announced loudly, hoping his voice would carry across the water. Any real man can handle whatever the ocean throws at him. All that military nonsense is just for show. Rivera and his teammates paid little attention to the recreational boat as they focused on their pre-dive briefings. Chief Martinez reviewed emergency procedures one final time, emphasizing the importance of maintaining buddy system protocols throughout the exercise. The cold water added an element of danger that required absolute adherence to safety standards. "Remember, hypothermia can affect judgment and motor function within minutes in these temperatures," Martinez warned. "Stay aware of your partner's condition and abort the dive immediately if you notice any signs of thermal stress. The exercise objectives are secondary to getting everyone back aboard safely." Rivera appreciated Martinez's emphasis on safety. He had witnessed diving accidents caused by overconfidence and poor preparation during his military career. The ocean demanded respect from everyone who entered her domain, regardless of their training or experience level. As the Navy team began entering the water, Bradley made a decision that would transform a routine training exercise into a life-or-death struggle. His alcohol-impaired judgment and need to impress his friends overcame any remaining traces of common sense he might have possessed. "Watch this," Bradley announced, reaching for the boat's engine controls. "I'll show those military boys what real seamanship looks like." The Northern Pride's engines roared to life as Bradley pointed the bow toward the Navy dive operations. His friends cheered encouragingly, unaware that their captain was about to commit an act that would endanger lives and violate numerous maritime safety regulations. Rivera had just entered the water when he heard the approaching engine noise. Standard diving protocols required recreational vessels to maintain safe distances from military training operations, but the fishing boat appeared to be heading directly toward the dive zone. He treaded water near the Seahawk, waiting for the approaching vessel to alter course and maintain proper separation. Instead, the Northern Pride continued its approach at dangerous speed, sending up a high bow wave that indicated reckless operation. Rivera could see figures on the deck pointing and gesturing in his direction, but their intentions remained unclear. Protocol required him to surface and await instructions from Chief Martinez before proceeding with the dive. The distance between the two vessels closed rapidly as Bradley maintained his aggressive course toward the Navy operation. His friends continued cheering and drinking, treating the situation as entertainment rather than recognizing the serious safety violation taking place. The potential for collision or injury to the divers in the water grew with each passing second. Rivera signaled to Chun and pointed toward the approaching recreational boat. Both divers understood the danger and began swimming toward their own vessel to clear the potential collision zone. The Seahawks crew also recognized the threat and began taking evasive action while monitoring the location of all personnel in the water. Chief Martinez grabbed the radio microphone and attempted to contact the Northern Pride on the standard maritime emergency frequency. "Recreational vessel approaching military dive operations. You are entering a restricted zone. Alter course immediately to avoid endangering personnel in the water." Bradley heard the radio transmission, but chose to ignore it, convinced that his actions demonstrated superior seamanship rather than dangerous incompetence. He maintained speed and course, bringing his vessel dangerously close to the Navy divers who were scrambling to reach safety. The wake from a Northern Pride reached Rivera just as he approached the Seahawk's dive platform. The turbulent water made it difficult to maintain position, and he had to fight against the artificial waves created by the recreational boat's reckless passage. Chun struggled with similar conditions as both divers worked to extract themselves from the water. What happened next would test every survival skill Rivera had learned during his 6 years of Navy service, transforming a routine training exercise into a desperate fight for survival in the unforgiving waters of the Pacific Ocean. The collision happened so fast that Rivera barely had time to process what was occurring. Bradley, emboldened by alcohol and his friend's encouragement, had decided to demonstrate his boat handling skills by passing dangerously close to the Navy dive operation. His judgment, already impaired by hours of drinking, failed him completely as he misjudged the distance between vessels. The Northern Pride's hull struck the Seahawk with tremendous force, the impact sending both boats lurching sideways in the choppy water. Rivera, who had been climbing onto the dive platform, was thrown backward into the frigid ocean as the collision tore through the Navy vessel's portside equipment storage area. The sound of crushing fiberglass and twisting metal echoed across the water as both captains fought to regain control of their damaged vessels. Bradley's boat suffered significant damage to its bow section, but the Northern Pride remained afloat and maneuverable. Bradley panicked as he realized the magnitude of his mistake, seeing Navy personnel in the water and understanding that he had just committed a serious federal crime. Rather than stopping to render assistance as maritime law required, he made another catastrophic decision driven by fear and alcohol-clouded thinking. "We need to get out of here," Bradley shouted to his friends, who had stopped celebrating and were beginning to understand the seriousness of their situation. "This is going to mean huge trouble with the military. They'll throw us all in prison." Kowalski, still clutching his beer can, stared at the damaged Navy vessel in shock. "Tom, we can't just leave. There are people in the water. We have to help them." But Bradley was already pushing the throttles forward, desperate to escape the scene before the Coast Guard arrived. The Northern Pride lurched away from the collision site, leaving a trail of debris and fuel in the churning water. Bradley's panic flight would later be recorded by multiple witnesses and satellite tracking systems, ensuring that he could not escape responsibility for his actions. Rivera found himself treading water in the middle of the collision zone, surrounded by floating debris and diesel fuel that created an oily slick on the surface. The impact had torn his diving gear loose, leaving him with only his dry suit for protection against the 42-degree water. Without his breathing apparatus and buoyancy control device, staying afloat required constant effort that would quickly exhaust his strength. The Seahawk was taking on water through the damaged hull section, forcing Chief Martinez to focus on keeping her vessel afloat rather than immediately rescuing the divers in the water. Emergency pumps activated automatically, but the extent of the structural damage made it uncertain whether the boat could remain operational long enough to complete rescue operations. "All personnel, emergency stations," Martinez announced over the vessel's communication system. "We have hull breach in the port equipment bay. Damage control teams report to pumping stations immediately. Rescue swimmers prepare for cold water extraction operations." Hospital Corpsman Walsh grabbed her medical kit and emergency thermal blankets, knowing that hypothermia would become life-threatening within minutes for anyone in the water without proper protection. The physiological effects of cold water immersion would begin immediately, starting with rapid breathing and increased heart rate that could lead to panic and drowning. Chun had managed to reach the Seahawk's stern platform before the collision occurred, but he immediately prepared to re-enter the water to assist Rivera. His dry suit and emergency flotation gear would provide crucial support for a rescue operation in these dangerous conditions. The buddy system that had been drilled into both divers during their training now became a matter of life and death. "Rivera's in the water without gear," Chun reported to Martinez. "I'm going back in to assist." Martinez evaluated the situation quickly. The Seahawk was fighting for its own survival, but Leaving Rivera in the water without assistance guaranteed his death within minutes. "Go," she ordered, "but stay in voice contact and don't become a casualty yourself." Rivera fought to control his breathing as the cold water began affecting his body's core temperature. Navy cold water survival training had taught him that the first few minutes were critical for preventing panic-induced drowning. He forced himself to breathe slowly and steadily while treading water, conserving energy for the extended survival battle ahead. The dry suit provided some insulation, but it had not been designed for long-term immersion without additional flotation support. Water had entered through the torn seal's damage during the collision, reducing its effectiveness and adding weight that made swimming more difficult. Rivera knew he had perhaps 10 to 15 minutes before hypothermia would begin affecting his motor coordination. Chun hit the water and swam toward Rivera's position, fighting through the debris field left by the collision. Pieces of broken equipment and spilled fuel created hazardous conditions that threatened to injure or trap anyone moving through the area. The distance between them was only about 50 yards, but it might as well have been miles given the deteriorating conditions. "Rivera, sound off," Chin called as he approached his teammate's position. "Still here," Rivera responded, though his voice already showed strain from the cold and physical exertion. "Lost all my gear in the collision. Suit's taking on water through damaged seals." Chun reached Rivera and immediately shared his emergency flotation device, a small inflatable vest that would help both men stay afloat while conserving energy. The shared equipment would not support them indefinitely, but it bought precious time for a rescue operation to develop. Meanwhile, the Seahawks' damage control efforts were showing mixed results. The emergency pumps were keeping pace with the water intake, but the hull breach was too large for temporary patching with onboard materials. Martinez faced the difficult decision of whether to abandon the rescue operation and head for shore before her own vessel sank. "Engine room, give me damage assessment," Martinez demanded over the internal communication system. "Hull breach extends below the waterline approximately 4 feet," came the response from engine man First Class Rodriguez. "Pumps are handling current intake, but we're at maximum capacity. Any additional damage or equipment failure will result in progressive flooding." The situation grew more complex as other vessels in the area began responding to distress calls. The Coast Guard Station San Diego had been alerted to the collision and was dispatching rescue helicopters and patrol boats, but their estimated arrival time was 25 minutes. Rivera and Chin could not survive in the water that long without additional assistance. A commercial fishing vessel, the Sea Hunter, was operating about 3 miles away when her captain heard the emergency radio traffic. Captain Maria Santos immediately altered course toward the collision site, knowing that every minute counted in cold water rescue operations. Her vessel carried proper rescue equipment and a crew trained in maritime emergency procedures. Rivera felt his body beginning to respond to the cold as his core temperature dropped. Shivering had started, which was actually a positive sign indicating that his body was still fighting hypothermia. But he knew from his training that the shivering would eventually stop as his condition worsened, and then he would have very little time left. "Chun, you need to get back to the boat," Rivera said through chattering teeth. "No point in both of us becoming casualties." "Negative," Chun replied firmly. "We go back together or we don't go back at all. That's how the buddy system works." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching helicopter rotors. A Coast Guard MH-60 Jayhawk had been diverted from a training flight and was arriving ahead of schedule, carrying rescue swimmers trained specifically for cold water operations. The distinctive orange and white aircraft represented hope for both men struggling in the frigid Pacific. Aviation survival technician Second Class Lisa Park prepared her rescue gear as the Jayhawk approached the collision site. At 24 years old, Park had completed over 100 rescue operations during her 3 years with the Coast Guard. Cold water extractions were among the most challenging and time-critical missions her unit faced. 2 personnel on the water both appear conscious and responsive, Park reported to her crew as she studied the scene below. Navy vessel appears to be maintaining buoyancy, but showing signs of damage. I'll extract the personnel in the water first, then assess the vessel situation. The helicopter pilot maneuvered into position above Rivera, and Chun as Park prepared for deployment. The rotor wash created additional turbulence on the water surface, making it more difficult for the men to maintain position. But it also cleared away some of the floating debris that posed entanglement hazards. Rivera looked up at the descending rescue swimmer and felt a surge of hope mixed with determination. His Navy training had prepared him for exactly this type of emergency, and he was not going to give up when rescue was so close. But the most dangerous part of their ordeal was just beginning, as hypothermia and exhaustion combined to create conditions where even experienced swimmers could panic and doom both themselves and their rescuers. The clock was running out, and every decision made in the next few minutes would determine whether Rivera and Chun would survive to see another day or become casualties of one man's reckless stupidity and cowardice in the face of consequences. Aviation survival technician Park hit the water with practiced precision, her rescue gear configured for immediate deployment in the dangerous conditions. The 42-degree water struck her like a physical blow even through her specialized dry suit, but her training had prepared her for the shock of cold water entry. She immediately began swimming toward Rivera and Chun, who were struggling to maintain position in the increasingly rough seas. Coast Guard rescue swimmer in the water, Park announced through her waterproof radio, making contact with two personnel. Both appear conscious but showing early signs of hypothermia. Rivera watched the rescue swimmer approach and felt both relief and concern. His 6 years of military training had taught him that rescues in these conditions were extremely dangerous for everyone involved. One panicking victim could easily drag down both his buddy and the rescue swimmer, turning a difficult situation into a complete disaster. "Stay calm and follow my instructions exactly," Park called out as she reached the two men. "I'm going to attach rescue harnesses, and we'll extract one at a time." "Who's in worse condition?" Rivera evaluated his own status compared to Chen's. His teammate still had most of his diving gear and better insulation, while Rivera's damaged dry suit was allowing more cold water to reach his core. The decision was obvious, though Rivera's military training made him reluctant to leave a teammate behind, even temporarily. "Take me first," Rivera said through chattering teeth. "Chen's got better gear and thermal protection." Park quickly assessed both men and agreed with Rivera's analysis. She attached the rescue harness around Rivera's torso, checking to ensure the fittings were secure and would not slip during the extraction process. The helicopter pilot maintained a steady hover overhead while the rescue winch operator prepared for the lift. "You're going up first," Park explained to Rivera. "Keep your arms at your sides and don't try to help with the extraction. Let the equipment do the work." The winch began lifting Rivera from the water, and he felt the incredible relief of being pulled away from the cold ocean that had been steadily draining his strength. But his concern for Chun remained paramount. The rescue swimmer was now alone in the water with his teammate, and the helicopter would need several minutes to complete Rivera's extraction before returning for the second pickup. Chun treaded water next to Park, fighting the effects of cold and exhaustion that were beginning to affect his motor coordination. Even with better equipment than Rivera, the prolonged exposure was taking its toll. The shared flotation device had helped conserve energy, but it could not prevent the gradual loss of core body temperature that threatened both men. "How are you holding up?" Park asked Chun as they watched Rivera being lifted toward the helicopter. "Getting cold, but still functional," Chun replied honestly. "Dry suit integrity is compromised, but better than Rivera's was. I can probably last another 10 minutes in these conditions." Park appreciated Chen's realistic assessment of his situation. Panic and false bravado killed more people in water rescues than actual drowning. Chen's military training was evident in his calm evaluation of the circumstances and his willingness to wait for proper rescue procedures rather than attempting something heroic and stupid. Above them, Rivera was being pulled into the helicopter by Crew Chief Petty Officer Martinez, who immediately began emergency warming procedures. Rivera's core temperature had dropped dangerously low during his time in the water, and preventing further heat loss was critical to his survival. Get him wrapped and start active warming. Park's voice crackled through the aircraft's communication system. I'm staying with the second victim. His condition appears stable, but won't remain that way much longer. The Jayhawk's medical equipment included emergency blankets designed to retain body heat and prevent further hypothermia. Rivera was conscious and responsive, but his fine motor coordination was noticeably impaired from the cold exposure. He tried to speak, but found his jaw muscles were not responding normally. Don't try to talk, Martinez advised as he worked to stabilize Rivera's condition. We're going to get your buddy and then head straight to the medical facility. You're going to be fine. Down in the water, Chen was beginning to experience the more serious effects of hypothermia. His shivering had become more violent, and he was having difficulty maintaining his position even with Park's assistance. The rescue swimmer recognized the signs and knew that the extraction window was closing rapidly. Pilot, I need immediate pickup for the second victim, Park reported. He's showing progression of hypothermia symptoms. We need to get him out of the water within the next 5 minutes. The helicopter pilot acknowledged the urgency and began maneuvering back into position over Chun and Park. The winch operator prepared the rescue equipment for the second extraction, working with the efficiency that came from hundreds of hours of training and real-world experience. Meanwhile, on the damaged Seahawk, Chief Martinez was fighting a losing battle to keep her vessel afloat. The hull breach was allowing water to enter faster than the pumps could remove it, and the boat was developing a noticeable list to port. She faced the difficult decision of ordering her remaining crew to abandon ship or continuing damage control efforts that might save the vessel. All hands, prepare for possible abandonment, Martinez announced. Damage control teams continue pumping operations, but be ready to evacuate on my command. Hospital Corpsman Walsh monitored the radio traffic from the helicopter rescue, knowing that Rivera and Chen would need immediate medical attention once they reached shore. Cold water immersion could cause dangerous changes in heart rhythm and blood pressure even after the victims were removed from the water. The warming process itself could trigger cardiac complications in severely hypothermic patients. The commercial fishing vessel Sea Hunter arrived at the collision site just as the Coast Guard helicopter was beginning Chen's extraction. Captain Santos immediately offered assistance to the Seahawk, which was clearly in distress and might require emergency evacuation of its crew. Navy vessel. This is fishing vessel Sea Hunter, Santos radioed. We're standing by to provide assistance or take on personnel if you need to abandon ship. Martinez appreciated the offer, but was not ready to give up on her boat yet. The Seahawk represented millions of dollars of military equipment and had strategic importance beyond its monetary value. If there was any chance of saving the vessel, she was obligated to make the attempt. Chen was lifted from the water as his condition continued deteriorating. The rescue swimmer Park came up with him on the same lift, having completed her mission successfully despite the dangerous conditions. Both men were now aboard the helicopter and receiving emergency medical treatment as the aircraft headed for the nearest trauma center. Rivera had regained some ability to speak as his core temperature slowly improved. How's Chun? He asked the crew chief who was monitoring his vital signs. He's going to be fine, Martinez replied. You both are. That was some impressive survival technique you used out there. Your military training definitely saved your lives. The helicopter flew toward Naval Medical Center San Diego, where a specialized team was preparing to treat both cold water immersion victims. Rivera and Chen would require careful monitoring for several hours to ensure that rewarming did not trigger dangerous cardiac complications or other delayed effects of hypothermia. Back at the collision site, the Seahawk was fighting for survival as her crew worked desperately to control the flooding. The commercial fishing vessel Sea Hunter stood ready to assist, while other Coast Guard units were responding to begin investigation of the collision and search for the recreational boat that had fled the scene. Bradley and his crew aboard the Northern Pride were making the biggest mistake of their lives by fleeing the scene. Maritime law required vessels involved in collisions to remain and render assistance to any injured parties. Their departure guaranteed that what might have been treated as an accident would now be prosecuted as a serious federal crime. The Coast Guard's investigation unit was already tracking the Northern Pride using radar and satellite data. Bradley's boat would be located within hours, and he would face charges that could result in decades in federal prison. His decision to flee had transformed a moment of poor judgment into a life-destroying criminal act. Rivera closed his eyes as the helicopter flew toward medical treatment, knowing that he had survived due to his training, his teammates' loyalty, and the professionalism of the Coast Guard rescue crew. But he also knew that the man responsible for nearly killing them was still running, and justice would need to be served for the criminal act that had endangered so many lives. The most dangerous part of their ordeal was over, but the consequences of Bradley's actions were just beginning to unfold, and they would reach far beyond anything he had imagined when he decided to show off for his drinking buddies. The emergency department at Naval Medical Center San Diego had been alerted to expect 2 cold water immersion victims, and the specialized trauma team was standing by when the Coast Guard helicopter touched down on the hospital's helipad. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the emergency medicine physician on duty, had extensive experience treating hypothermia cases and understood the critical nature of the rewarming process. Rivera and Chun were wheeled into separate treatment bays where medical teams immediately began comprehensive assessments of their condition. Rivera's core temperature had dropped to 94 degrees Fahrenheit, while Chen's was slightly higher at 95 degrees. Both men were conscious and responsive, but they required careful monitoring to prevent rewarming shock and cardiac complications. Start active external rewarming protocols, Dr. Walsh ordered as she examined Rivera. Monitor cardiac rhythm continuously and watch for signs of afterdrop as we bring his temperature up. Blood pressure is stable, but we need to be prepared for sudden changes. Rivera could feel sensation returning to his extremities as warm blankets and heating pads gradually raised his body temperature. The medical team worked with practiced efficiency, drawing blood samples to check for electrolyte imbalances and other complications that could result from prolonged cold exposure. "How long were you in the water?" Dr. Walsh asked as she checked Rivera's pupil responses and neurological function. "Approximately 18 minutes from collision to extraction," Rivera replied, his speech becoming clearer as his condition improved. "Water temperature was 42 degrees. I lost most of my protective equipment during the impact." "Dr." Walsh nodded, making notes in Rivera's medical record. 18 minutes in 42-degree water was approaching the limit of human survival, even for someone in excellent physical condition with military training. Rivera's survival was testament to both his preparation and his mental discipline during the crisis. In the adjacent treatment bay, Chun was responding well to warming procedures. His better equipment had provided crucial protection during the extended water exposure, and his core temperature was rising steadily without complications. The medical team was optimistic about both men's prospects for full recovery. "Any word on the vessel that caused the collision?" Chun asked the nurse monitoring his vital signs. "The Coast Guard is handling the investigation," she replied. "They'll want to interview both of you once the doctors clear you for questioning." Meanwhile, the Coast Guard's investigation was proceeding rapidly. The Northern Pride had been tracked by radar as it fled toward Los Angeles Harbor, where Bradley apparently hoped to blend in among the hundreds of recreational boats anchored in the marina. His plan demonstrated the same poor judgment that had caused the collision in the first place. Investigator Chief Warrant Officer Rebecca Martinez led the Coast Guard's response team as they prepared to apprehend Bradley and his crew. Maritime law enforcement carried the same authority as federal law enforcement on land, and fleeing the scene of a collision was a felony that could result in substantial prison time. "Target vessel is entering Marina del Rey," reported the Coast Guard patrol boat Vigilant as it closed on the Northern Pride. Damage visible to the bow section consistent with collision reports. For persons visible on deck, Bradley had finally sobered up enough to realize the magnitude of his situation, but his options were extremely limited. Running had only made his legal problems worse, and now he faced federal charges that could destroy his life. His construction business, his boat, and his freedom were all at risk because of 20 minutes of drunken stupidity. "Tom, we need to turn around and go back," Kowalski urged as he saw the approaching Coast Guard vessel. "Running is only making this worse. We need to face up to what happened." But Bradley was trapped by his own lies and ego. He had spent years telling people about his non-existent military service, and now real military personnel had nearly died because of his actions. Admitting responsibility meant admitting that everything he had told his friends about himself was fabricated. "They can't prove anything," Bradley insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "It was an accident. Accidents happen all the time on the water." The Vigilant drew alongside the Northern Pride and activated its emergency lights and siren. The Coast Guard boarding team was armed and authorized to use whatever force was necessary to stop the fleeing vessel. Bradley's options had run out completely. Recreational vessel Northern Pride. This is the United States Coast Guard. Cut your engines immediately and prepare for boarding. You're under arrest for leaving the scene of a marine collision. Bradley reluctantly complied, knowing that resistance would only add more charges to his growing legal problems. The Northern Pride's engines fell silent as the Coast Guard boarding team secured both vessels together with safety lines. Chief Warrant Officer Martinez led the boarding party as they stepped onto the Northern Pride's deck. The smell of alcohol was immediately apparent, and she could see empty beer cans scattered around the cockpit area. The evidence of impaired operation would support additional charges beyond the collision itself. "I'm placing all 4 of you under arrest," Martinez announced as her team secured the scene. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Bradley's friends were shocked to find themselves facing federal charges. They had thought they were going on a fishing trip, not participating in a criminal act that had endangered lives. Their association with Bradley was about to cost them dearly in legal fees and potential prison time. Back at the hospital, Rivera and Chun were stable enough to provide detailed statements to Coast Guard investigators. Both men gave comprehensive accounts of the collision, describing Bradley's reckless approach and apparent intoxication. Their testimony would be crucial evidence in the federal prosecution that was certain to follow. The recreational vessel approached at high speed directly toward our dive operation, Rivera explained to the investigator. "Standard maritime protocol requires recreational traffic to maintain safe distance from military training exercises. This vessel deliberately violated that separation." Chun corroborated Rivera's account and added details about the aftermath of the collision. The recreational vessel fled immediately after impact. They made no attempt to render assistance or check for injuries. That's a clear violation of maritime law. The Seahawk had been successfully saved by the heroic efforts of its crew and the assistance provided by Captain Santos aboard the Sea Hunter. Emergency pumps had controlled the flooding long enough for temporary repairs to be completed, allowing the vessel to reach port under its own power. Chief Martinez's decision to fight for her ship had paid off, saving millions of dollars in military equipment. The investigation revealed that Bradley's blood alcohol content was nearly twice the legal limit for operating a vessel. Combined with the collision, the flight from the scene, and the endangerment of military personnel, he faced multiple felony charges that carried potential sentences measured in decades rather than years. Federal prosecutors moved quickly to file charges against Bradley and his crew. The lead prosecutor, Assistant United States Attorney David Chun, was known for his aggressive pursuit of maritime crimes. He understood that strong prosecution of this case would send a clear message to other recreational boaters who might consider similar reckless behavior. This case represents a complete disregard for maritime safety and the lives of military personnel, Chun announced at a press conference. The defendant's actions endangered multiple lives and damaged federal property. "We will seek the maximum penalties allowed under federal law." Rivera and Chun were released from the hospital after 24 hours of observation, with no lasting effects from their cold water ordeal. Their military training and physical conditioning had enabled them to survive conditions that could have killed civilian victims. They returned to duty with new appreciation for the dangers they faced and the importance of proper safety procedures. The incident became a case study in cold water survival training for Navy diving schools across the country. Rivera's calm response to the emergency and his successful application of survival techniques were held up as examples of how proper training could overcome even life-threatening situations. But for Rivera personally, the experience had been transformative in ways that went beyond survival training. He had faced death and emerged stronger, with renewed confidence in his abilities and deeper respect for the ocean that was both his workplace and his adversary. The criminal who had nearly killed him would face justice, but Rivera's focus was already shifting back to his mission and his teammates who depended on his skills and dedication. The legal proceedings against Bradley and his crew were just beginning, and the full consequences of their actions would unfold over the coming months as the federal justice system demonstrated that endangering military personnel carried severe penalties that would serve as a deterrent to others who might consider similar acts of reckless stupidity. 6 months after the collision, the federal courthouse in San Diego was packed with Navy personnel, Coast Guard investigators, and maritime safety advocates as the trial of Tom Bradley and his crew reached its conclusion. Assisting United States Attorney David Chun had built an overwhelming case against the defendants, presenting evidence that demonstrated not only Bradley's criminal negligence, but also his pattern of lies and deception that had led to the near-fatal incident. Bradley sat at the defendant's table looking nothing like the confident boat captain who had terrorized Navy divers 6 months earlier. His construction business had collapsed under the weight of legal fees and negative publicity. The Northern Pride had been seized by federal authorities and sold to pay restitution costs. His marriage had ended when his wife discovered the extent of his drinking problem and dishonesty about his military service. Rivera took the witness stand on the final day of testimony, wearing his dress blue uniform with the ribbons that marked his 6 years of distinguished Navy service. His calm, professional demeanor stood in stark contrast to Bradley's increasingly desperate appearance as the evidence mounted against him. Please describe the events of December 15th as you experienced them, Prosecutor Chun requested. Rivera's testimony was precise and devastating. He methodically described Bradley's reckless approach, the collision that nearly killed him, and the cowardly flight that followed. His military bearing and obvious credibility made him an extremely effective witness against the man who had nearly ended his life. The defendant's vessel approached our training area at high speed in a deliberate violation of maritime safety protocols, Rivera testified. After causing the collision that endangered multiple lives and damaged federal property, he fled the scene without rendering assistance as required by law. Defense attorney Marcus Sullivan had little to work with given the overwhelming evidence against his client. Bradley's flight from the scene, his obvious intoxication, and the testimony of multiple military witnesses made conviction virtually certain. Sullivan's strategy focused on minimizing the sentence rather than claiming innocence. My client acknowledges that he made serious errors in judgment that day, Sullivan argued in his closing statement. He has expressed genuine remorse for his actions and is prepared to accept responsibility for the consequences. But Prosecutor Chun was not interested in leniency for a man whose actions had nearly killed 2 Navy divers through pure reckless stupidity. Maritime law existed specifically to prevent incidents like this one, and strong enforcement was necessary to protect all mariners from similar criminal behavior. The defendant operated his vessel while intoxicated, deliberately endangered military personnel engaged in training operations, caused a collision that nearly resulted in multiple deaths, damaged federal property, and then fled the scene in violation of his legal obligation to render assistance, Chun summarized for the jury. This was not an accident or an error in judgment. This was a series of criminal acts that demonstrate complete disregard for human life and maritime law. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against Bradley. The evidence had been so overwhelming that longer deliberation would have been pointless. Bradley was convicted of operating a vessel under the influence reckless endangerment of federal personnel, collision with a federal vessel, failure to render assistance, and fleeing the scene of a marine accident. Judge Patricia Williams scheduled sentencing for the following month, but she used the opportunity to address Bradley's complete lack of remorse throughout the trial process. Despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt, he had continued to claim that the collision was an accident and that he bore no responsibility for the near deaths of Rivera and Chun. Mr. Bradley, your actions on December 15th represent a complete failure of character and judgment that nearly cost two young men their lives, Judge Williams stated. Your subsequent flight from the scene and continued refusal to accept responsibility demonstrate that you pose a continuing danger to public safety. Bradley's 3 crew members received lighter sentences after cooperating with the investigation and expressing genuine remorse for their roles in the incident. Kowalski, Thompson, and Mueller had all been drinking that day, but they had not been operating the vessel and had urged Bradley to return to help the victims. Their cooperation and acceptance of responsibility earned them reduced charges and probationary sentences. The sentencing hearing drew national attention as maritime safety organizations used the case to highlight the dangers posed by reckless recreational boaters. Rivera and Chun both attended to provide victim impact statements that would help determine Bradley's final sentence. The defendant's actions nearly ended my life and the life of my teammate, Rivera told Judge Williams. His decision to operate while intoxicated and then flee the scene showed complete disregard for basic human decency and maritime law. The only reason Chun and I are alive today is due to our training, the professionalism of the Coast Guard rescue team, and pure luck. Chen's statement focused on the broader implications of Bradley's criminal behavior. This case demonstrates why maritime laws exist and why they must be enforced, he explained. Military personnel put their lives at risk every day in service to our country. They should not have to face additional danger from criminals who choose to operate vessels while intoxicated and ignore basic safety protocols. Judge Williams sentenced Bradley to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. He was also ordered to pay complete restitution for damage to the Seahawk and medical costs for Rivera and Chun. The sentence was among the harshest ever imposed for a maritime collision case, reflecting the serious nature of Bradley's crimes and his continued refusal to accept responsibility. The defendant operated a deadly weapon while intoxicated and used it to endanger the lives of military personnel, Judge Williams explained as she imposed the sentence. His subsequent flight from the scene and lack of remorse demonstrate that only a substantial prison term will protect the public from his criminal behavior. Rivera returned to active duty with renewed dedication to his military service and enhanced reputation among his fellow divers. The incident had proven that his training and character were solid enough to handle life-threatening emergencies, earning him the respect of his superiors and recommendations for advanced training programs. Chief Martinez nominated Rivera for the Navy Achievement Medal for his outstanding performance during the emergency. His calm response to the crisis and successful application of survival techniques had not only saved his own life, but also provided valuable lessons for other Navy divers facing similar situations. Petty Officer Rivera demonstrated exceptional courage and professionalism under the most dangerous circumstances, Martinez wrote in her recommendation. His survival of this incident is a testament to both his training and his character. He represents the finest traditions of Navy diving operations. Chin also received recognition for his loyalty to his diving partner and his professional conduct throughout the crisis. The incident strengthened the bond between the two divers and reinforced their commitment to the buddy system that had helped save both their lives. The Seahawk was fully repaired and returned to service with upgraded safety equipment and improved damage control systems. The collision had provided valuable lessons about vessel survivability that were incorporated into future Navy ship designs. Captain Santos of the Sea Hunter received official commendation from the Coast Guard for her immediate response and assistance during the emergency. The case became required study material at the Coast Guard Academy and various maritime law enforcement training programs. Bradley's criminal behavior and its consequences served as a powerful example of why maritime laws existed and why they needed to be strictly enforced. For Rivera, the incident had been a defining moment that tested everything he had learned during his military career. He had faced death in the cold Pacific waters and emerged stronger, with deeper appreciation for his training, his teammates, and the dangerous profession he had chosen. The criminal who had nearly killed him was now paying the price for his actions, but Rivera's focus remained on his mission and his fellow divers who counted on his skills and dedication. The ocean that had nearly claimed his life continued to be his workplace and his challenge. But Rivera now understood even better that survival in that environment required not only technical skill and physical conditioning, but also the mental strength to remain calm and make good decisions when death was only minutes away. These lessons would serve him well throughout the remainder of his distinguished Navy career, as he continued diving in some of the world's most dangerous waters in service to his country.